The sky broke open before dawn, not the gentle kind of rain that eases into morning, the kind that softens the dry ground and coaxes the last wildflowers into blooming one more time before winter. This was the other kind. The kind that came sideways across the valley with no warning and no apology, driving cold needles into every exposed surface, turning the road into a slow-moving river of brown mud that sucked at hooves and swallowed wheel tracks whole. Corbin Hale did not hurry. He had learned long ago that hurrying in a Montana storm only made a man wetter and angrier, and he was already both. He stood at the edge of the small rise behind his cabin with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up and his hands hanging loose at his sides, the way they always did when he was standing in front of the two crosses that marked the only ground on his property he had never once considered selling. The larger cross was rough-cut pine, weathered gray now after 4 years of Montana seasons. He had made it himself the same week he buried her, working in the barn by lantern light because he could not sleep and could not eat and could not do anything useful except move his hands. The second cross was smaller, much smaller. He had made that one too, though he had needed Jasper Reed's help to drive the stakes into the frozen ground because his own hands had not been steady enough that day. Eleanor May Hale, beloved wife and mother, 1856 to 1878. He did not read the words. He had not read them in a long time. He knew them the way a man knows the geography of his own land, not by looking, but by the feel of the thing beneath his boots, the shape of it in the dark. He stood there for a while. He always did, mornings like this, though he could not have explained why to anyone who asked. He was not a man who talked much about the things that mattered. He had tried once, in the early months after Eleanor died, to say something true and useful about grief to his neighbor Jasper Reed over a bottle of rye whiskey. He had gotten as far as the words it doesn't get before the sentence collapsed inside him, and he had just sat there with his hands wrapped around his glass until Jasper quietly poured him another and let the silence do the work instead. The silence had been doing the work ever since. 4 years of it. 4 years of mornings that started at this small patch of ground and ended at the barn, then the fence line, then whatever needed doing on 300 acres of Montana range that refused to care whether the man working it was whole or broken. The land did not ask about Eleanor. The horses did not ask. The cattle did not ask. The work simply existed, and he did it, and each day closed behind him like a door. That was enough. He had decided a long time ago that it was enough. He touched the top of Eleanor's cross once, the way he always did. 2 fingers laid flat against the wet wood. Then he turned and walked to the barn. The gray horse, Hector, lifted his head when Corbin came through the door. Ears pricked forward, nostrils working. He was an old horse, 17 years old, with a fused ankle that had been giving him trouble since August and a white blaze down his face that had gone yellow at the edges with age. The horse that made sense to keep, by any practical measure, was the younger sorrel in the next stall. But Corbin had owned Hector since the animal was 4 years old, and there were things a man simply did not do. He saddled the horse slowly, checking the cinch twice the way Eleanor had taught him, because she had been more careful about horses than he had ever been, and the habit had stayed with him even after everything else. Then he led Hector out into the rain and swung up and turned north toward the ridge road. He had fence to check. 3 days of heavy rain had a way of weakening posts along the North Creek, and he had already lost 2 young steers to a neighbor's pasture last spring because he had been slow about it. He was not going to be slow about it again. The valley was gray and drowned looking. the distant mountains swallowed entirely by low cloud, so that the horizon simply ceased to exist. The grass on either side of the road lay flat and silver. The creek to his left ran high and loud, the color of strong coffee, carrying sticks and foam and the occasional lost branch from somewhere upstream. Corbin rode with his hat brim shedding water in a steady curtain and his eyes moving the way a man's eyes move when he has worked the same land long enough that anything out of place registers before his conscious mind catches up. That was how he saw her. Not right away. First he saw a shape, and the shape was wrong. Too low to be a fence post, too still to be a deer, too small to be anything with 4 legs. He slowed Hector and squinted through the rain, and then he saw that it was a person, and then that the person was a woman, and then, as he drew closer and the details resolved themselves out of the gray morning, he understood that something had gone badly wrong for whoever this was. She was sitting on the ground at the edge of the road where the gravel gave out to mud, not lying down, not standing, sitting, the way a person sits when they have decided to stop moving, but have not yet decided what to do instead. Her dress was dark with water, the blue fabric plastered flat against her arms and her back. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the morning in, and hung in wet ropes along her jaw and neck. Her shoes were gone. Or not gone, he saw as he got closer, but so thoroughly destroyed that they were more memory than footwear, the soles flapping open at the toe, the leather split along both sides, the color of the skin of her feet visible through the gaps. She was holding something in both hands. A small bag, dark with rain, pressed against her ribs with a grip that had nothing to do with the bag's weight and everything to do with the fact that it was apparently the last solid thing in her world. She looked up when Hector stopped. Her eyes were brown and reddened at the rims, not from crying, or not only from crying. It was the particular redness that comes from wind and cold and days of exposure, from a face that had been unprotected in weather for longer than any face should be. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, and not quite anything he had a word for. It was the expression of someone who had been surprised so many times, and so badly, that surprise itself had worn smooth. Corbin looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you headed?" His voice came out rough, the way it always did before it had been used enough in the morning. He heard how flat it sounded and could not do anything about it. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered, "I don't know anymore." 3 words. He had heard 3-word sentences before that said very little. This one said a great deal. It said that she had known at some earlier point and that the knowing had been taken from her, and that she had not yet found anything to replace it with. It said that whatever she had been moving toward was gone. It said that she was sitting in the mud in a Montana rainstorm, not because she had stopped to rest, but because she had run out of road in a way that had nothing to do with geography. Hector shifted under him. The rain came down. Corbin reached down his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the way someone looks at something they are not sure they have permission to take. Then she took it, and he pulled her up onto the horse behind him, and they rode the 1 mile back to his cabin without speaking a single word. She was lighter than he expected. That bothered him more than he let it show. Diamonds. The cabin was exactly what it was, which was not much. He had built it himself 12 years ago, with help from his father and a neighbor whose name he had already half forgotten, and it had been a serviceable structure then, and was still serviceable now, in the way that things are serviceable when no one particularly cares about them beyond their function. The windows were dusty. The floor was swept, but not scrubbed. The table had a stack of papers on one end that had been there long enough to become part of the furniture. The dishes in the basin had been washed that morning but stacked carelessly, the way a man stacks dishes when he is the only one who ever uses them. And above the stove, on the row of iron hooks, where Eleanor had once hung her aprons and her good pot holders and the cloth she used for straining milk, there was one apron still, faded. The blue had gone gray. The hem had frayed in 2 places. He had not taken it down. He was not sure, when he thought about it, which he did not do often, whether he had left it there out of sentiment or out of the simpler fact that taking it down would have required him to decide what to do with it afterward. And that was a decision he had not been ready to make in 1878 and had not gotten any readier to make in the 4 years since. He did not look at it when he came in. He had trained himself not to. He knelt by the stove and built up the fire until it caught properly, feeding it small pieces of split wood until the orange light steadied and the warmth began to move outward into the cold room. Behind him, he heard the woman set her bag down. He heard her wet shoes on the floor. He did not hear crying, which surprised him slightly, and which he filed away without comment. He stood and got the wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed and held it out without turning around. "Get warm," he said. She took it. Her fingers brushed his, and they were so cold that the contact registered in his hand like touching metal in January. He kept his face still. He went to the stove and poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table near the heat. She wrapped both hands around the cup, the way you do when your hands have been cold for a long time, and warmth is something you have to relearn slowly. He saw how much they were shaking, and he saw that she was trying to hold them still, and he looked away to give her the privacy of that. He sat across the table and let her drink. Steam rose from her dress as it began to dry. The smell of wet wool filled the small room, and under it, barely there, a faint trace of something floral. Lavender, he thought, or something like it. The kind of scent that belonged to a different life, to a trunk packed carefully in a boarding house somewhere far from here, to small, deliberate choices made by a woman who had expected to arrive somewhere and be welcomed. He waited. She set the cup down when it was half empty and looked at him with eyes that had gone a little steadier. "Ohio," she said. "Cincinnati. I worked at a textile mill. Morrison and Sons." She spoke the way someone speaks when they are telling a story they have already told to themselves so many times that the words have worn grooves. Not flat, exactly. Careful. Like she was measuring each sentence before she released it, checking its weight. "My parents died when I was 17. Scarlet fever. Both of them, the same week." She paused. "I've been working since I was 17. Corbin nodded. He did not offer condolences. He had never found condolences useful, and he suspected she had not either. "Then I saw the advertisement," she said. "In the Cincinnati paper. A rancher in Montana. Seeking a wife. Hardworking and sincere." Her hands moved to the bag in her lap. She had brought it with her from the door and set it on the table between them, and her hands returned to it the way hands return to familiar objects in moments of difficulty. "We wrote letters for 3 months. He seemed like a man who meant what he said." She reached into the bag and took out a bundle of envelopes, tied with a length of kitchen string. The paper was soft and damp, the edges gone wavy with rain. The ink in places reduced to pale blue shadows. She held them without opening them. "He said he would meet me at the Willow Creek Depot. He said he would be wearing a blue kerchief." The fire crackled. Outside, the rain against the roof was a steady, impersonal sound. "I waited 2 days," she said. "I slept on the bench inside. After the second day, I knew he wasn't coming." She said this without flinching. That was the thing he noticed. She did not flinch. She delivered the information about the 2 days and the bench and the absence of the blue kerchief the way a person delivers information about weather conditions or road distances, as though she had processed the humiliation of it privately, in full, and what remained was simply the fact of what had happened. "So I started walking," she said, "toward any town I could find. A woman on the road gave me bread on the second day. That was all." She looked down at the bundle of letters. "His name," she said, "was Aldous Price." Corbin went still. It was a small stillness, the kind that does not announce itself. His hands did not move. His expression did not change. But something happened behind his eyes, some rapid internal accounting, and the result of that accounting sat in his chest like a stone. He knew Aldous Price. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Aldous Price. He ran the general store on the main street, the one with the green-painted door, and the scale that everyone privately suspected was slightly dishonest, but no one had ever proven. He had a wife named Constance, a practical-looking woman who wore her hair in a plain knot and ran the store's books with a competence that clearly exceeded her husband's. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who sometimes sat on the front steps of the store in the afternoon. He had a white fence around his house. He had never, in the time Corbin had known him, owned or operated or expressed any interest in owning or operating a ranch. He had never owned a ranch in his life. Dessa was watching him. She had the stillness of someone who had learned to read silences the way other people read faces, and she was reading his. "You know him," she said. It was not a question. Corbin looked at her for a moment. He thought about how to say it. He thought about what it would do to her to hear it, and he thought about what it would mean to let her find out some other way, in some worse moment, in front of other people. "He has a family," Corbin said. "A wife, 2 children. He's run the general store in town for about 6 years. Something moved through her face. It was not collapse. It was not the kind of devastation that looks like a building falling. It was quieter than that. A single degree of change in the set of her jaw. A single slow breath taken and released. A recalibration so precise and so internal that if he had not been watching closely, he would have missed it entirely. She stood. She picked up the letters from the table. She walked to the stove, and she opened the iron door. And she began feeding the letters into the fire one at a time. She did not rush. She dropped them in slowly, methodically, watching each one catch and curl and reduce itself to black. 3 months of correspondence. 3 months of a man's careful deceptions, his invented descriptions of a life he did not have, his instructions for a journey she should never have taken. It all burned. It burned quickly, the way lies tend to burn, faster than the truth ever does. When the last page had gone to ash, she closed the stove door and turned around. "He knows I'm here," she said, "in Willow Creek." Corbin said nothing. "Then he's worried," she said. It was not the tone of a woman making a threat. It was the tone of a woman making an observation about the nature of things. It was the tone of a woman who had just burned 3 months of promises in a stranger's stove and was already thinking about what came next, because someone had to, and there was no one else in the room who was going to do it for her. Corbin looked at her for a long moment. He heard himself say the words before he had fully decided to say them. "You can stay here. There is a room. It has a lock on the door." She looked at him with that careful, measuring expression, the expression of a person who had learned not to accept things until they understood what the acceptance would cost. "I don't take charity," she said. "I work for what I have." "I know," he said. He stood and banked the fire for the night and went to his own room and closed the door. He lay in the dark for a long time without sleeping, listening to the rain on the roof, listening to the small sounds of another person settling into the unfamiliar quiet of a house that had contained only one person for a very long time. Diamonds. In the morning, the sun came through in pale, slanted light, and the smell that reached him when he opened his door was cornbread, round, golden, set in the center of a clean table, beside a tin of butter, beside a cup of coffee already poured. The basin was empty. The dishes were stacked. The floor had been swept. The stack of papers from the corner of the table had been neatened into a tidy pile. Dessa stood at the stove with her hair pinned up and his old apron around her waist, her back to him. She did not turn when he came in. "I don't take charity," she said again, quietly, to the stove. Corbin sat down. He cut a piece of cornbread. He ate it. It was round. It tasted the way his mother's had tasted. The particular combination of stone-ground meal and rendered lard and a touch more salt than most people used, and the recognition of it moved through him without warning, something small and old and entirely undefended against. He did not say anything about that. He ate his breakfast and drank his coffee and watched Dessa move through his kitchen with the quiet precision of someone who is profoundly competent and has learned not to make a production of it. He thought that whatever Aldous Price had imagined he was doing when he wrote those letters and collected those 3 months of careful hope from a woman in Cincinnati, he had made a mistake that was far larger than he understood. Later that morning, Dessa asked if she could plant something along the front of the porch. "Some flowers," she said, "if he didn't mind." He almost said no. It was such a small thing, and small things had a way of becoming other things, and he had spent 4 years keeping the world very still and very manageable and very much the same from one day to the next. He knew what flowers by the porch meant. He knew what it meant when a person asked to put something permanent into the ground of a place. But she was looking at him with those steady brown eyes, patient, not pleading, simply waiting for an honest answer. And he heard himself say, "Plant what you want." That afternoon, he was fixing the fence post on the north side of the property, his back to the cabin, his attention on the split wood and the driving of new stakes into ground that had gone soft with rain. At some point, he realized he had been hearing a sound for several minutes without registering it. Quiet, intermittent, carried on the breeze from the direction of the cabin. He straightened and turned. Dessa was kneeling in the dirt in front of the porch, sleeves pushed past her elbows, using his old hand spade to turn the soil in small, careful portions. She was humming. Something low and simple, not quite a song he could name, just a line of melody repeated without hurry. The late afternoon sun came across the valley at that particular September angle that turned everything it touched to something between gold and bronze, and her hair caught it and held it. He watched her for a moment longer than he should have. Then he turned back to the fence post and drove the stake in and discovered that he had misaligned it by nearly 2 inches. He set the mallet down. He did not look back at the cabin again, but that evening, when supper was done and the dishes washed and Dessa had gone to her room, Corbin sat on the porch steps in the cooling dark and looked out over the valley and thought about Aldous Price, who had written letters to a woman in Cincinnati for 3 months and described a life that did not exist, and who had seen that woman's face through the window of his store this week and had gone quietly into the back room. He thought about what that meant. He thought about what a man like that did when he was afraid of what he had done. Jasper Reed had stopped by that afternoon while Dessa was still working in the garden, nodding once at her and then pulling Corbin aside near the barn. Jasper was not a man who alarmed easily. He had ranched this valley for 20 years and had seen enough to take most things in stride, but his eyes had been careful when he spoke. "I'm glad you stopped for her," Jasper said. "Truly. But Corbin, you know how this town talks. And you know Aldous Price is not a man who stays quiet when he's got something to lose." Corbin had said nothing. He had listened, the way he always listened, and let Jasper's words sit where they landed. Now he sat in the dark, and the valley lay open before him, and the first stars were coming out above the far ridgeline, and from inside the cabin there was the quiet sound of a woman moving through a room, setting things down, settling in, alive and safe and present in a place she had not expected to be. He thought that Jasper was probably right. He thought that the days ahead were not going to be simple. He went inside, locked his own door, and went to sleep. The first week passed the way first weeks sometimes do between strangers forced by circumstance into close quarters, carefully, with attention paid to the small negotiations of space and silence that neither party names aloud, but both understand completely. Corbin woke each morning to find the cabin already changed. Not dramatically, nothing so large as to demand acknowledgement or comment, but changed nonetheless, in the particular way that a place changes when someone who notices things has spent time in it. The window above the basin had been wiped clean on the inside. The stack of harness leather he had piled near the door and stepped around for the better part of 6 months had been moved to the wall beside the door, where it took up the same space but occupied it in a way that no longer constituted an obstacle. The coffee was always made. The fire was always going. The table was always clear. He did not comment on any of it. Neither did she. What he noticed, beyond the practical changes, was the quality of her silence. Dessa Morrow was not a quiet woman in the way that some people are quiet because they have nothing to say. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are paying close attention, when they are taking in more information than they are putting out, when the interior life is considerably busier than the exterior one suggests. He caught her sometimes watching him with an expression that was not intrusive, not unkind, simply alert, as though she were learning the grammar of a new language and had not yet decided whether she liked the sound of it. He understood this. He had no objection to it. He did the same thing himself. On the third day, she asked him about the ranch, not in the way that a curious stranger asks, looking for conversation. She asked the way someone asks when they are trying to understand something they intend to be useful about. She asked about the cattle numbers, the grazing rotation, the quality of the north pasture versus the south. She asked about the fence posts along the creek and why he'd replaced some with pine when the older ones were fir. He found himself answering more fully than he had intended to, because her questions were specific in the way that indicated she was actually listening to the answers and building something with them. She did not ask about Eleanor. She did not ask about the apron on the hook, or the 2 crosses on the rise behind the cabin, or the particular quality of silence that lived in this house. She asked about cattle and fence posts and pasture drainage and whether the well ran sweet or brackish in the dry months. He appreciated this more than he knew how to say, and so he did not try to say it. On the fifth morning, he went to the barn before dawn and found the old gray horse, Hector, standing with his left foreleg raised, not bearing weight, his head low and his ears back. Corbin went in quietly and ran his hands down the leg until he found the heat, the swelling just above the fetlock, the particular tenderness that made the horse flinch and pull away from even gentle pressure. He had seen this before. He knew what the practical response to this was. Hector was 17 years old with a history of joint trouble and a market value that would not cover a good saddle blanket. The sensible thing, the thing that a man running a working ranch on margins that did not leave much room for sentiment, was to make a decision and make it cleanly. Corbin sat down on the floor of the stall with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out in front of him, and began working on the legs slowly, patiently, the way Eleanor had shown him years ago. Warm compress first, then the long, slow strokes from knee to ankle, not pressing, just maintaining contact, letting the animal understand that the hands on him were not hurting hands. He had torn a strip from an old feed sack and soaked it in water from the trough, and he kept the compress warm by wringing it and reapplying it again and again, while the barn filled gradually with the pale gray light of early morning. Hector turned his head after a long while and nosed at Corbin's shoulder. Corbin kept working. He did not hear Dessa come in. He only knew she was there when he happened to look up, and she was standing in the open barn door with a cup of coffee in each hand and the early light coming in around her from behind, and she was watching him with that attentive expression of hers. She had been there long enough that the coffee had stopped steaming, long enough to have seen the whole of it, the compress and the slow strokes and the horse leaning into the contact of those careful hands. She set one cup on the edge of the stall rail without a word and walked back to the cabin. He drank it. It was still warm. He did not say anything about it at breakfast, and neither did she, but when he passed her in the kitchen doorway that evening, their eyes met briefly, and he understood that something had been communicated between them that neither of them was ready to put into language yet. He was not sure exactly what the content of that communication was. He knew only that it was not nothing, and that it had weight. Diamonds. 3 days later, she put the ledger on the table in front of him. He had not asked her to look at it. The ledger had been sitting on the shelf near the window for several months, a record of ranch expenses and income that he kept because a man running a ranch had to keep records. She had gone through it, not casually, thoroughly. There were small pencil notations in the margins in her handwriting, precise and unornamented, and she had opened it to a page in August where a column of figures had been added up incorrectly, resulting in an error that had cascaded through the following 3 months and produced a picture of the ranch's finances that was, it turned out, somewhat less dire than he had believed it to be. The August sum was wrong, she said. She was not looking at him. She was drying a dish with a cloth, her back half turned. Everything after that was built on the wrong number. You have about $40 more than you thought you did. He looked at the page for a long moment. I did accounts at the mill, she said. Not officially. Mr. Morrison never knew. I just corrected the numbers when the foreman got them wrong and left the corrected sheets where he would find them and think he had done it himself. Why? Corbin asked. Because it was easier than letting him know he needed help, she said. Men usually are. He looked back at the ledger. He thought about this for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "Thank you." She nodded once, which was the right response, and neither of them made more of it than that. Diamonds. On the 7th day, Jasper Reed stopped by to look at the fence line they shared along the east boundary. Corbin told him about Dessa. Jasper listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Corbin had always valued about him. "She's staying?" Jasper asked. "For now." Jasper nodded slowly. He looked out over the east pasture with his hands in his coat pockets. "I've known you a long time, and I don't say this to make trouble." He paused. "You know how this town talks. It's going to start soon, if it hasn't already. You ought to be ready for that. And she ought to be ready for it more." Corbin said he knew. He was not entirely sure, if he was honest with himself, that he had been ready for exactly how it felt when it started. Diamonds. One morning, sorting through the lining of her bag for the mending needle she kept there, Dessa's fingers found something she had not expected. A single envelope, lodged deep in the lining seam, the flap sealed shut with the rain-stiffened paper of something that had been wet and dried and forgotten. She recognized the handwriting before she had fully registered what she was holding. She held it for a long moment in the morning light. Then she set it on the shelf above the basin without opening it. She did not throw it away. She did not burn it. She was not sure yet what she intended to do with it, and she was a woman who did not act on things until she was sure. Diamonds. The trip to town happened on a Tuesday, toward the end of the second week. Dessa needed to mail a letter. He had said he would take her in the wagon. Neither of them discussed what that meant in practice, walking into Willow Creek together for the first time, presenting themselves to the attentive eyes of a small town that had nothing significant to occupy it on a slow September Tuesday except the fact of their arrival. The drive-in was quiet. The morning was cool and bright, the sky that particular hard blue that Montana produces in September when the summer haze has burned off and the air has not yet gone to the gray of coming winter. Dessa sat on the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap, not tight, not visibly anxious, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that he recognized as preparation. The way a person's body organizes itself before a thing it already knows will be difficult. Willow Creek came into view around the long curve past the Miller property. The church steeple first, then the water tower, then the rooftops in their irregular line against the hill behind the town. A quiet place by any measure. 40 or 50 families. A school, a church, a saloon, the general store with its green-painted door, the sheriff's office with its single barred window facing the street, the mill down by the creek that gave the town its name and most of its commerce. Corbin tied the horse at the rail outside the general store. The bell above the door rang when they went in. Eugenia Follette was behind the long counter at the far end, and two women he recognized as the Harlan sisters were standing near the bolts of dry goods fabric, and all three turned when the bell rang, which was normal, and then did not turn back to what they had been doing, which was the beginning of something else entirely. Eugenia had been the primary collector and distributor of information in Willow Creek for as long as Corbin had been in the valley. She was not malicious in any straightforward way. She was a woman who had made the interior lives of her neighbors into a kind of ongoing project, who collected details with the care and attention that some people give to useful things, and who shared them with what she clearly believed was a genuine spirit of community interest. She was also, Corbin knew, precisely the wrong person to encounter on a morning like this one. Her eyes went to Dessa and stayed there with the particular quality of attention that precedes judgment. "Corbin Hale," she said pleasantly. "It has been a while." And then, with a precision that did not pretend to be casual, "And who is this?" "She's staying at my place," Corbin said. He heard how flat it came out. Staying, Eugenia repeated. Dessa met her look with a steadiness that Corbin found, in that moment, quietly remarkable. She did not look down. She did not look away. She looked at Eugenia Follett with an expression of complete and courteous composure, the kind of composure that costs something to maintain, and that the woman maintaining it is fully aware of the cost, and said simply, "Good morning, ma'am." Eugenia blinked. It was a very small blink, nearly imperceptible. But Corbin saw it, and he understood that something had been communicated in Dessa's 4 words and her steady eyes that went considerably beyond the surface of the exchange. She had said that she understood the situation completely. She had said that she had decided to meet it standing up. She had said, without saying it, that she had encountered this particular quality of attention before, and had developed a response to it that left no opening for cruelty to enter through. Eugenia recovered herself in the way that practiced social operators always do, quickly and without visible seam. "Good morning," she said. Her voice had gone slightly careful. At the far end of the counter, half hidden by a display of seed packets, stood a man Corbin had not noticed when they came in. Martin Jenkins, who worked at the tannery and who had the particular gift of being in places where things were said and then in other places where those things could be repeated. He was not looking at them. He was looking at the seed packets with the focused attention of a man who has never in his life cared about seeds. Corbin noted this. He did not say anything about it. Dessa completed her business at the mail window without hurry, asking the appropriate questions about postage in a tone of complete normalcy, signing the register in her small, precise hand, completing the transaction as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. When they stepped back out onto the boardwalk and walked toward the wagon, Corbin heard the voices start behind them through the open store window. "Mail order," one voice said. "Left at the depot like a piece of unclaimed freight." "Living out there with Hale alone," said another. "You know how long she's been there. Does anyone know anything about where she actually came from? Does anyone know her people?" Dessa walked beside him with her chin level and her pace unchanged and her hands loose at her sides. She did not turn. She did not give the voices behind her the dignity of a reaction. "They don't know anything about you," he said quietly. "No," she said. "They don't." She was quiet for a moment. "But they've already decided what they know. That's a different thing." He thought about that for the rest of the drive home. He thought about the particular kind of damage that decisions disguised as knowledge could do to a person, especially a person who had no history in a place, no network of relationships that could counterbalance the weight of a story once it started moving. He also thought about Jenkins and the seed packets and the quality of attention that Jenkins had been paying to things that were not seeds. He thought about that quite carefully. Diamonds. That evening, he found her on the porch steps in the cooling dark. She was sitting with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap, looking out over the valley. Her shoulders were moving, very slightly, with a rhythm that was not breathing. He stopped in the shadow of the barn door. He had known grief in the way that a man knows it when he has lived inside it for years, and he understood that what he was witnessing was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. It was the necessary private release of something that had been held with extraordinary effort through an entire day of being watched and evaluated. It was the cost of dignity, paid in the only currency available, which was the dark and the solitude and the belief that no one was watching. He did not go to her. He went to the cedar chest inside the front room and took out the heavy wool blanket, the good one that he kept for the coldest nights, and brought it back to the porch and draped it over the railing within her reach, close enough that she would find it without having to look for it, without having to ask. Then he went inside and closed the door softly behind him. In the morning, the blanket was gone from the rail and folded neatly on the chair just inside the front door, and Dessa was already at the stove. And when she turned to hand him his coffee, their eyes met for a moment in which something passed between them that was acknowledgement and something more than acknowledgement, something that had no clean name, but that both of them understood to be a kind of agreement, that they would do this, that they would be decent to each other, that whatever was coming, they would face it without pretense. He drank his coffee. The morning moved forward. It was on the following Tuesday that Jasper Reed appeared at the door again, earlier than expected, his hat in his hands and his expression carrying the weight of news that a man does not want to deliver. He sat down at the table. He looked at his hat. He said, "I'm going to tell you something plainly, and I need you to hear it before you react." Corbin set the ledger aside and waited. "Aldous Price went to see Sheriff Briggs on Friday," Jasper said. "He signed a formal statement. He says he saw a woman matching Dessa's description near the bank the night before the robbery last month. He used her name specifically, Dessa Morrow, named her outright." The room was very quiet. Corbin sat with this. The fire ticked in the stove. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the paddock. He let the information settle, and he looked at it clearly, the way he tried to look at everything clearly before he spoke or acted, because he had learned that clarity before action mattered more than speed. He thought about Aldous Price, walking into the sheriff's office. He thought about Aldous Price, who had written letters for 3 months to a woman he had never intended to meet, who had constructed a careful fiction of a ranch and a future and a life of honest partnership for the sole purpose of attracting a response from someone desperate enough to take it seriously. He thought about what kind of man did that, assembled a lie with such patience and such detail, and then went further, went to the law with a signed statement carrying a woman's name, when the only threat she posed was her knowledge of what he had done. The kind of man who was cornered. The kind who had calculated that the best way to protect himself from the truth was to discredit the person who held it before that person could use it. "Is Briggs moving on it?" Corbin asked. His voice was level. "Not yet. He's cautious by nature, Briggs is. He'll want something more before he does anything formal." Jasper turned his hat in his hands. "But Corbin, you know Jenkins. And once Jenkins has something to work with, it doesn't stay quiet. The story replaces the truth. That's how it works here." Corbin looked out the window. Through the glass, he could see Dessa at the far end of the garden, her back to the cabin, kneeling in the afternoon light with the small hand spade. The flowers had taken. September was late for planting, and he had privately doubted that anything she put in the ground at that angle of the season would survive the first real cold. But she had known something about that patch of ground that he had not known, about the way the porch overhang caught the morning sun and held it, about the drainage of the soil on that particular side of the front steps. And the plants had rooted and put up green and were now doing exactly what she had said they would do. She was completely unaware of what had just been said inside this room. Something moved through Corbin in that moment that was not anger, though it contained anger as one of its elements, and was not fear, though fear was present in it too. It was something older than either of those things, and more fundamental, the particular clarifying feeling of a boundary being crossed, a line violated, not against him, but against someone living under his roof, who had not done a single thing in 3 weeks to deserve what was being organized against her. "What are you going to do?" Jasper asked. "What needs doing," Corbin said. After Jasper left, Corbin sat at the desk for a long time without moving. He did not go out to the garden. He did not tell Dessa that evening what Jasper had brought. He needed to understand the full shape of it first, needed to see all of its dimensions clearly before he could speak about it to the person it was aimed at. He owed her that. He made supper himself that night. Dessa came in from the garden with soil on her hands and loose hair and washed at the basin without comment and sat down across from him, and they ate together in the way they had developed over nearly 3 weeks now, quietly, without ceremony, without the particular performance that people put on when they are uncomfortable in each other's company. She looked up once during the meal and held his eyes for a moment with that particular attentiveness of hers. "Something happened today," she said. Not a question. He considered deflecting. He had been doing it for 4 years with everyone who had tried to ask him anything real. He was skilled at it by now. "Yes," he said instead. She waited. "I'll tell you tomorrow," he said, "when I've thought it through properly." She held his look for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, a single clean acknowledgement, and returned to her supper. She did not press. She did not perform anxiety or demand more than he had offered. Diamonds. Later, after the dishes and the banked fire and the ordinary small sequence of events that had become their evening routine, he stood on the porch alone in the cooling dark and looked out at his valley. The moon was up, high and thin, casting just enough light to outline the ridgeline and silver the tops of the grass. He passed the kitchen on his way to his room and stopped. Dessa had left the almanac he kept on the shelf open on the table to the October page. In pencil, in her small, careful hand, she had written a note beside the predicted frost dates. It said, "The marigolds will need covering by the 12th if the temperature drops before they harden off. Leave the wild asters. They will manage." She had been on his property for 3 weeks. She was already planning for next month. She was already, in the quiet, unannounced way that she did everything, building a future here out of whatever materials were available, out of knowledge and attention and the willingness to put things in the ground and tend them and trust that they would hold. Corbin looked at her small penciled note for a long time in the lamplight. Then he closed the almanac gently and set it back on its shelf. He went to his room and lay down in the dark and listened to the sounds of a cabin that was no longer entirely his. He did not examine this feeling closely. He was not ready to examine it closely. But he did not push it away either, which was itself a kind of answer to a question he had not yet allowed himself to ask. The news about Oliver Cross came on a Wednesday morning, carried by a boy Corbin did not recognize, a thin child of perhaps 10, who arrived on foot from the direction of town and stood at the porch rail with his hat crushed between both hands and said that Miriam Cross's boy was sick and had been sick for 3 days, and the doctor had said there was nothing more he could do, and that Mrs. Cross was asking if anyone knew of any other kind of help. Corbin was in the barn when the boy came. Dessa was at the table with the ledger and a cup of tea, and she was the one who opened the door and heard what the boy had to say. By the time Corbin came in from the barn, she was already at the shelf where she kept the cloth bag she had brought with her from Cincinnati, the one she had supplemented over the past 3 weeks with things she had gathered from the creek bank and the hillside behind the cabin. Dried bundles tied with thread and labeled in her careful handwriting. She was not asking permission. She was putting on her coat. "Oliver Cross," she said. 8 years old. Fever 3 days. No improvement. The doctor's given up. She looked at Corbin directly. "I need to go." He looked at her bag, at the dried herbs and the small bottles, at the practical certainty in her hands and her posture. He thought about asking her what she knew, what she had done before, what the basis was for the confidence she was moving with. He decided that the moment did not call for those questions. "I'll harness the wagon," he said. Miriam Cross lived on the west edge of town in a small house with a leaning porch and a kitchen garden that had been well kept once and was beginning to go to seed in the way that gardens go when the person tending them has been occupied with something more pressing than weeds. She was a widow. Her husband had died of a lung complaint 2 winters ago, and she had been managing alone since then, the way women managed alone in small Montana towns, which was completely and without visible acknowledgement of how much the completeness cost. She opened the door when they knocked and looked at Dessa with an expression that was equal parts hope and the particular wariness of a mother who has already been disappointed by the people who were supposed to know what to do. "He's in there," Miriam said. She looked at Dessa's bag. "What do you know about fever?" "Enough," Dessa said. She went in. Corbin stayed at the door. He was not needed inside, and he understood that clearly. What was happening in that back room was between Dessa and the child and Miriam, and his presence would only make the space smaller and the air heavier. He sat on the porch step and waited, the way he had learned to wait, without impatience, without demanding that time move faster than it intended to. After a while, he heard Miriam's voice, low and worried, asking something. He heard Dessa's voice answer, calm and clear, explaining something about the preparation of a compress, about temperature and timing, about what to watch for and when to adjust. He heard the particular tone in Dessa's voice that he had not heard before, a tone that was not the careful, measured cadence she used in ordinary conversation, but something older and more direct, the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was doing it without the need for anyone's approval. He sat on that porch step through the afternoon. The sun moved, the shadows lengthened. A neighbor came by, looked at him, started to say something, thought better of it. He nodded at her, and she moved on. At some point, Miriam came to the door and handed him a cup of coffee without a word and went back inside. He drank it. Near dusk, Dessa came out. She sat down on the step beside him, not immediately, and not without the particular controlled care of someone who has been focused entirely on one thing for many hours and is now allowing themselves to stop. "The fever broke about an hour ago," she said. "He needs watching through the night. I told Miriam what to do and left her the compress and the elderflower preparation. She knows what to watch for." Corbin looked at her. The late light was coming across the valley at a low angle, and it caught the tiredness in her face, the particular exhaustion of sustained concentration. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were still. "You've done this before," he said. "In Cincinnati, there was an old woman named Mrs. Hobart who lived in the building next to the mill," Dessa said. "She had come from somewhere in Pennsylvania, from a family that had been doing this kind of thing for generations. She let me help her when I had time. She taught me what she knew." She paused. She said the knowledge was too old and too useful to let die with her. Corbin thought about that. He thought about the chain of it, one woman teaching another, passing something practical and life-saving from hand to hand across time, across geography, against the consistent indifference of the world to whether such things survived or not. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." The word came out without planning, and he heard it land in the air between them. He did not try to correct it or qualify it. He let it stand. And Dessa, who heard everything, did not react to it in any visible way. She simply stood up and picked up her bag and walked to the wagon, and he followed, and they drove home in the cooling September dark without speaking, the silence between them comfortable in a way that silences between two people only become after something real has passed between them. 3 days later, without ceremony or announcement, Oliver Cross appeared at the edge of the property with a fistful of wild asters and a gap-toothed smile. He found Dessa in the garden and thrust the flowers at her with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about sincerity. "Ma says you saved me," he announced. Dessa took the flowers. She crouched down to his level, which Corbin noticed from the porch, that she did it automatically, that she understood instinctively the importance of meeting a child at their own height. "Your ma saved you," she said. "She stayed up all night watching over you. I just told her what to do." Oliver considered this with the serious expression of someone weighing competing claims. "Ma says both," he decided. Dessa smiled. It was a full smile, one of the few Corbin had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely in a way that he found he was not prepared for. He looked away and pretended to examine the fence post he had been leaning against. Miriam Cross came to the ranch the following afternoon with a covered dish and an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite friendship, but was the beginning of both. She and Dessa sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and talked for an hour while Corbin found reasons to be in the barn. When Miriam left, Dessa stood in the doorway watching her go, and there was something in her posture that was different from the careful watchfulness she usually wore, something that was less defended, as though something had shifted in her sense of where she stood in this place. Diamonds. It was on the evening of the day after Miriam's visit that he took Dessa to the graves. He had not planned to, or rather, he had been not planning it for 3 weeks, which is a different thing from simply not planning. He had been aware of the graves at the edge of every day since Dessa arrived, the way a person is aware of an unopened door in a house they live in, not thinking about it constantly, but never entirely forgetting it either. He came in from the north fence line in the late afternoon and found Dessa on the porch reading the almanac, making more of her small pencil notes in the margins. She looked up when he came around the corner of the cabin, and something in his expression apparently communicated something he had not intended to communicate, because she set the almanac down and looked at him with a question that she did not ask aloud. "Come with me," he said. He led her around the back of the cabin to the small rise that caught the late sun in the afternoon and held it longer than the rest of the property. The 2 crosses stood as they always stood, the larger one weathered gray, the smaller one beside it that he had needed help to drive into the frozen ground. He stood in front of them and looked at the names. "Eleanor May Hale," he said. "My wife. She died in September of 1878. She was 22 years old." He stopped. The stopping was not dramatic. It was simply the pause of a man arriving at the edge of something he has not said aloud in a very long time. She had dark hair. She laughed at things other people didn't notice. She was better with horses than I ever was. She taught me how to do the compress on Hector's leg. He paused again. The other cross is for the child. A boy, the doctor thought. He didn't have a chance. He looked at the crosses. He did not look at Dessa. "I haven't said any of this to another person," he said. "Not the whole of it. Not in 4 years." He was quiet for a moment. "But I thought you should know who I am before you decide anything about staying or going. I thought you deserved that much." Dessa did not say she was sorry. He had told her enough about himself by now for her to understand that sorry was not what he needed and not what Eleanor deserved either. What she did instead was lower herself to her knees on the ground in front of the larger cross and begin, with careful hands, to remove the dried grass and the small encroaching weeds that had grown up close to the base of it, working slowly and with attention, as though the tending of this small patch of ground was the most natural thing in the world to be doing at this particular moment. He watched her do this. He felt something move through him that he had not felt in a very long time, and that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not grief, or not only grief. It was something that grief had been covering for 4 years, the way snow covers ground, something that was still alive underneath, and that the warmth of the past 3 weeks had begun, very slowly and without his permission, to bring back toward the surface. His eyes filled. He turned away before it showed. He stood with his back to the graves and looked out over the valley in the late gold light of a September afternoon that was already beginning to feel like October, and he breathed carefully, in and out, the way a man breathes when he is keeping something inside that needs keeping. Behind him, he heard Dessa working quietly in the dirt. He heard the soft pull of weeds from the ground. He heard her set them aside. He heard the small, ordinary, patient sounds of a person tending something that mattered. After a while, he turned back around. She was still kneeling. She looked up at him with an expression that was not pity and not sorrow exactly, but was something that contained both of those things and went beyond them, something that was the expression of a person who understood from the inside what it was to carry loss that was too large to put down and too heavy to carry comfortably, and who was not asking him to do either. They walked back to the cabin in the last of the light without speaking. At the door, she went in ahead of him and went directly to the stove and began making supper. And he sat down at the table and watched her move through his kitchen and thought that whatever this was, whatever was happening in this cabin between two people who had arrived at this particular point in their lives with their particular freight of loss and survival, it was real in a way that very few things in the past 4 years had been real. Diamonds. That night, late, after supper and the dishes and the ordinary close of the day, they sat by the fire. This had become a habit without either of them declaring it a habit, the way habits form between people who are paying attention to each other. He in his chair, she on the bench with her mending or her reading, the fire between them doing the work of filling the silence with something warm. She set her mending down. "My father used to sing on Sunday evenings," she said. She was looking at the fire. Not hymns, old songs from somewhere his people had come from, songs he only half remembered the words to. He would hum the parts he didn't know and sing the parts he did, and it didn't matter that it was incomplete. She paused. "My mother taught me to read using the Bible she had been given at her confirmation. She said reading was the one thing no one could take from you once you had it." Dessa stopped. Her hands were still in her lap. "I sold that Bible. I sold it with everything else when I bought the train ticket." She said it without self-pity, as a plain fact. "That is the thing I am most ashamed of." Corbin looked at her for a moment. Then he stood without speaking and went to his room. He opened the bottom drawer of the small chest that had been Eleanor's, the drawer he had not opened since the summer of 1878, and he took out the Bible that was there. It was small and black, well worn at the spine, the pages soft with years of use. He carried it back to the front room and set it on the table in front of Dessa. "Eleanor's," he said. "She would want it read." Dessa looked at the Bible, She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it for a long time with an expression he could not entirely read, and then she reached out and opened it to the back page, and there in Eleanor's handwriting, in the faded ink of a woman who had been gone 4 years, were the words, "For the days when hope is hard to find." Dessa read the words. She ran one finger along the line of them, very gently. Then she reached for the pencil that was always on the table near the almanac. She looked at the words for a long moment, and then, beneath Eleanor's line, in her own small, careful hand, she wrote, "And sometimes hope finds you." She looked up at him. He was already looking away, but he did not take the Bible back. He sat down in his chair and looked at the fire and let the silence do what it did, which was to hold the moment without crushing it. Diamonds. It was 2 days after this that Aldous Price came to the ranch. Corbin saw him coming from the north fence line, a rider on a good horse moving at a deliberate pace down the access road, and he recognized both the horse and the particular upright posture of the man in the saddle before he could make out the face. He set down his tools and walked back toward the cabin without hurrying, arriving at the yard at roughly the same time as Price. Aldous Price was a compact man in his middle 40s with a neat beard and the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of reasonable good fellowship. He wore his town clothes even on the road. He smiled when he saw Corbin, the practiced smile of a merchant, and touched his hat brim. "Hail," he said, "hoping I might talk to you about those 3 young steers you had at market last month. My brother-in-law's been looking to expand his herd." Dessa had come to the cabin doorway. She stood in the frame with one hand on the wood, and when Price's eyes moved to her, they did so immediately, and with a precision that he tried to disguise as casual notice. Something in his expression shifted beneath the smile, a tightening around the eyes, a reassessment happening in real time. "The steers aren't available," Corbin said. Price kept the smile in place with the ease of long practice. "Well, if that changes, you know where the store is." He lingered a moment longer than the conversation required. His eyes moved back to Dessa once more, briefly. The glance of a man checking the position of something he considers a threat. Then he turned his horse. He was halfway down the access road when he spoke again, not loudly, but loudly enough. "Man wants to be careful," he said, his back to them, his voice carrying on the still air with the particular clarity of words intended to be heard without being addressed directly. "Bringing in someone he doesn't know the full history of. Bad business, that." He rode on. Dessa had not moved from the doorway. Her face was composed. But Corbin looked at her hands and saw that the knuckles of the hand gripping the doorframe had gone white, and he understood that the composure was costing her something in that moment, and that she was paying it without letting it show, and that this was, in its way, a form of courage as real as any other kind. He walked to the porch. He did not look after Price. He looked at Dessa. "He's afraid of you," Corbin said. She looked at him. "That's why he came," Corbin said. "Not for steers. To look at you. To remind himself that you're one person and he's established and known and has been here 6 years. To reassure himself that what he set in motion is going to be enough." He paused. "He came because he's not certain it is." Dessa released the doorframe slowly. She looked out over the yard where the dust from Price's horse was still settling. "What has he set in motion?" she said. And this was the moment Corbin had been waiting to be ready for. The moment he had been thinking toward since Jasper Reed had sat at his table with his hat in his hands. He told her. All of it. The signed statement. Jenkins. The way these things moved through a town once they started moving. He told her without softening it and without alarm, in the even tone of a man presenting facts that need to be examined. She listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He's trying to make me into something I'm not," she said, "before I can say what he is." "Yes," Corbin said. She nodded slowly. She looked at the yard, at her garden, at the flowers that had taken root against the reasonable expectations of September. She looked at all of it for a moment, and he could see her thinking, and he could see the thinking resolve itself into something clear and firm in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes. "Then we need to be faster than he is," she said. Corbin looked at her. He thought that Eleanor would have liked this woman enormously. He thought it clearly and without guilt, which surprised him, and he let the thought stand where it was without pushing it away, which surprised him more. "Yes," he said, "we do." They went inside. The fire was low and the evening was coming in fast off the mountains. Dessa put more wood on the fire, and he sat at the table, and they began, quietly and practically, to think about what came next. Not with panic, but with the steady, patient attention of two people who had both survived difficult things and had learned, separately and now together, that difficult things were best met with clear eyes and calm hands. Outside, the dark came down over the valley, and the first stars appeared above the ridge, and the fire inside the cabin burned warm and even. And Corbin Hale sat across the table from Dessa Morrow and thought that whatever Aldous Price had imagined he was doing when he rode out here this afternoon, he had made a serious miscalculation. He had looked at one person and seen someone alone. He had not looked carefully enough. The morning Sheriff Briggs came with the formal order. The frost had arrived overnight for the first time that season. It lay thin and white across everything: the grass, the garden beds, the top rail of the paddock fence, the flat stones along the path from the cabin to the barn. It was the kind of frost that burned off by mid-morning and left no trace. But while it lasted, it transformed the ranch into something that looked like a drawing of itself, precise and still and colorless at the edges. Dessa had been up before dawn covering the marigolds with cloth, moving through the white garden in the gray pre-light with her breath making small clouds, which was exactly what her penciled note in the almanac had said she would need to do. Corbin had watched her from the barn doorway without going out. He had been watching her more than he meant to lately, not in a way he could have easily explained or defended if asked to explain or defend it, simply in the way that a man watches something that has become important to him before he has finished deciding whether to admit that it has. He was mucking the near stall when he heard the hooves on the access road. He heard the pace of them and knew before he got to the door that it was more than one horse. And he knew from the particular deliberate rhythm of horses ridden by men who are performing an official function that this was not a social call. Sheriff Norton Briggs rode in front. He was a square, weathered man in his late 50s who had been sheriff of Willow Creek for 11 years and who had, in Corbin's experience, conducted himself with a consistency of fairness that was not common in men with his degree of uncontested authority. Behind him rode two deputies. Dessa was at the garden's edge, still in her work coat, the cloth she had used to cover the marigolds folded over her arm. She had heard the horses, too. She was standing still, watching them come, with the morning light coming in flat and cold across the frosted ground, and the three official faces approaching at the pace of something that had already been decided. Corbin came out of the barn. Briggs pulled up and touched his hat. "Corbin!" Then to Dessa, with a courtesy that was genuine, even if its context was not, "Miss Morrow." "Sheriff," Dessa said, "Miss Morrow, I have a formal order here for your temporary detainment pending investigation into the Willow Creek bank robbery of September the 4th, Briggs said. He reached into his coat and produced the folded paper. "I am not placing you under arrest. You are not charged with anything. But I am required to ask you to remain in town, within my direct oversight, until the investigation reaches a conclusion." The frost glittered on the garden behind her. The marigolds were covered and protected under their cloth, exactly as she had planned. The wild asters, which she had said would manage on their own, stood upright and unhurried in the cold. Dessa looked at the order in Briggs's hand. She looked at it with the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular piece of news and finds when it arrives that expecting it does not make it significantly easier to receive. Then she turned to Corbin. "I'll go," she said. "Dessa." His voice came out lower and rougher than he intended. "If I don't go willingly, they'll have cause to make it something worse," she said. She said it quietly, just for him, and with a patience that was not resignation. It was the patience of a woman who understood the mechanics of her situation more clearly than he did, and was not going to let him complicate it with emotions that, however real, were not useful in this particular moment. "And if I stay here and they come back with more authority, you will lose things you cannot get back." She held his eyes. "I will not let that happen." She handed him the cloth she had been carrying. "Put that back over the marigolds when you come in," she said. "The frost will come again tonight." Then she walked to the sheriff's horse and waited, and Briggs dismounted and helped her onto his horse with the careful courtesy of a man who knows he is doing something that does not sit entirely right with him, and they rode back down the access road toward Willow Creek. And Corbin stood in the frozen yard and watched them go until the road was empty and the sound of the hooves had faded into the ordinary sounds of the October morning. He stood there for a long time after. The cloth was in his hands. It smelled of the garden, of dirt and green things, and the particular cold mineral smell of the first frost. He looked down at it. He thought about Dessa covering the marigolds before dawn, before any of this, with the matter-of-fact diligence of someone who had decided that this place and these things were worth tending, worth protecting, worth planning for. He put the cloth back over the marigolds. Then he went inside and sat at the table and thought about Aldous Price. He thought about him for a long time, going over it from every angle, understanding the structure of what Price had built, a signed statement, an official record, the particular protective coloration of a man who had been in a community for years, who had a wife and children and a business, whose word had weight simply because of its familiarity. Against this, a woman who had been in the valley for less than a month, who had no family here, no history, no one to stand in front of the town and say, "I have known her for 20 years, and she is not what is being said about her." Price had understood the geometry of it precisely. He had placed his signed statement like a stone in a stream, redirecting the current before anyone thought to question where the stone had come from. Corbin thought about Constance Price. He had seen her at the store for years. He had exchanged the ordinary transactional words with her. He had observed her in the way he observed everyone, carefully and without much comment, and what he had observed was a woman of considerable competence and considerable containment, a woman who ran the actual operations of the store while her husband ran the front of it. He had also observed, over the years, the particular quality of the silence between Constance and Aldous Price. It was not the comfortable silence of two people who had made their peace with each other. It was the pressurized silence of a woman who knew more than she said and had decided, for reasons of her own, to keep knowing it privately. He thought about what might change that calculation. He thought about what Constance Price deserved to know, and about whether deserving was reason enough to tell a person something that would alter her life irrevocably. And he sat with the weight of this question for a long time before he concluded that the answer was yes. Not because it would help Dessa, though it would, because it was true, and Constance Price had been living beside a lie long enough. Diamonds. Jasper Reed appeared at noon. He had heard the way news moved in Willow Creek, and his face when he came through the door carried the expression of a man who has arrived to help but is not yet sure what help looks like. "What do you need?" Jasper said. "I need you to stay with the horses this afternoon," Corbin said. "I'm going to town." Jasper looked at him for a moment. "Corbin, you go in there angry. You'll make it worse." "I'm not angry," Corbin said. Jasper studied him. "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose you are." He sat down at the table. "What are you?" Corbin picked up his coat. "Clear," he said. He rode in on the sorrel. The town was in its ordinary mid-morning activity when he arrived, the boardwalk carrying its usual traffic, the mill running, the smell of wood smoke and horse and dry October air coming off the street. He tied the sorrel at the rail outside the general store. The bell above the green door rang when he went in. The store was occupied. 4 customers, 2 of them women he recognized, 1 man at the hardware section, 1 boy reading the labels on the candy jars. Aldous Price was behind the main counter with his merchant's expression firmly in place. He saw Corbin and the expression remained, perhaps slightly more carefully maintained than usual. "Hail," he said pleasantly. "What can I do for you?" Constance Price was at the far end of the counter, entering figures into the ledger with the focused attention of a woman doing real work. She looked up when Corbin came in and then back down at her ledger. Corbin walked to the counter. He reached into his coat and took out the letter. It was the one Dessa had found in the lining of her bag, the single letter that had survived the burning, the one she had given to Corbin without ceremony, saying only that he should have it in case it was ever useful. The paper was soft and worn at the fold. The ink had smeared in places from the rain, but the signature at the bottom was clear, the handwriting distinctive and unambiguous. He placed the letter on the counter between himself and Aldous Price. "I'd like you to tell me if that signature is yours." The pleasantness left Price's face. Not dramatically, it simply withdrew. The way light withdraws from a room when a cloud passes over, and what was left underneath was a face that was calculating something and doing it quickly. "I don't know what that is," Price said. "It's a letter," Corbin said. "Written on your store's paper, which I recognize, and signed with your name, which I also recognize, to a woman in Cincinnati describing a ranch in Montana that you invited her to come and share as your wife." The store had gone quiet. He had known it would go quiet. He had counted on it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Price said. His voice had gone careful and flat, the voice of a man retreating to his last defensible position. Corbin did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice once in this entire conversation, and he did not intend to. He turned. He looked at Constance Price. She had stopped writing. She was looking at the letter on the counter with an expression that Corbin recognized because he had worn a version of it himself. The expression of a person arriving at a confirmation of something they have suspected for a long time and have been hoping, with diminishing hope, was not true. "Mrs. Price," Corbin said. He kept his voice level and direct. You deserve to know what this letter says. Dessa Morrow traveled from Cincinnati to Willow Creek in September because your husband wrote her a series of letters over 3 months describing himself as a widowed rancher seeking a wife. He arranged to meet her at the depot. He did not go. She walked 40 miles in 3 days before I found her on the road. The store was completely silent. Constance Price looked at the letter. She looked at it for a long time. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the thing happening behind them is too large and too private to be allowed any expression at all in a room full of witnesses. Then she looked at her husband. Aldous Price opened his mouth. Constance set down her pen. She set it down with a precision and a finality that was more articulate than anything she could have said. She untied the apron she was wearing, the practical cotton apron that she wore every day in the store. The apron she put on each morning as part of the ordinary routine of a woman running a business and a household and a marriage that she had apparently been running largely alone. She folded it once and placed it on the counter beside the ledger. She walked around the end of the counter and out through the green door without speaking a word to anyone. The bell above the door rang when she went out. It rang again a moment later when 2 of the customers followed, murmuring to each other. The remaining people in the store stood very still, looking at Aldous Price, who was looking at the door his wife had walked through with the expression of a man who has watched the load-bearing wall of his life step outside and is only now beginning to understand the structural implications. Corbin picked up the letter and folded it and put it back in his coat. She deserved the truth, he said to Price. That's all this was. He walked out. He found Constance Price on the boardwalk 20 feet from the door, standing with her arms at her sides and her face turned toward the street with the particular stillness of a woman who is processing something enormous in real time and has enough dignity to do it without an audience. He did not stop. He gave her the same courtesy he had given Dessa on the porch that first night, the respect of not witnessing what was not his to witness. He went directly to the sheriff's office. Briggs was at his desk. He looked up when Corbin came in with the expression of a man who had heard the bell above the general store door and the particular quality of the silence that followed and had drawn a reasonable preliminary conclusion. Dessa was sitting in the chair against the wall, her hands in her lap, her back straight. She looked at Corbin when he came through the door with the controlled expression she always wore when she was holding something carefully. He looked at her and gave the smallest possible nod, and something in her face shifted by a single degree, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of the permission to consider relief. He told Briggs what he had done. He told it plainly and completely, without editorializing, because Briggs was not a man who needed editorializing, and because the facts, arranged in order, were sufficient. Briggs listened. He was quiet for a moment after Corbin finished. Then he picked up his hat. "Stay here," he said to both of them. He was gone for nearly 2 hours. Diamonds. Corbin sat in the chair against the opposite wall. Dessa sat in hers. The office held the particular quality of silence that exists in small official rooms where important things have recently happened and might be about to happen again. A clock on the wall marked the time with a sound like a quiet argument. At some point, Dessa said, without preamble, "I wrote a letter to a friend in Ohio last week, asked her if there was still work at the mill." Corbin looked at her. "I didn't send it," she said. She was looking at the floor in front of her, not at him. "I wrote it and I sat with it for a day, and then I put it in the stove." She paused. "I want you to know that. I want you to know I made the choice before any of this happened. Before Price came to the ranch, before Briggs came, this morning." She looked up and met his eyes. "I am not staying because I have nowhere to go." The clock marked the silence. "I know," Corbin said. She held his look for a moment longer, and then something in her face did what he had rarely seen it do. It softened, just slightly, just enough, the carefully maintained composure easing by a single degree in a direction that was not retreat but arrival. The expression of a person who has said the important true thing and been met with the response it deserved. "Diamonds." Briggs came back at mid-afternoon. He came through the door and hung his hat on the hook beside it and sat down at his desk and looked at his hands for a moment before he looked up. His face had the expression of a man who has uncovered something unpleasant and is deciding how to present it with the minimum of unnecessary drama. "Constance Price came to see me," he said. "She had quite a bit to say." He paused. "She has known about the letters for some time. She found the copies he kept, which was a foolish thing for him to keep, in the back of his desk drawer last spring. She did not confront him. She was waiting, I think, for a reason she could not entirely have explained." He folded his hands. "She also told me that on the night of September the 4th, Aldous Price was in their home the entire evening. She is prepared to state that formally. She also told me that the description he gave in his statement, the one about the woman near the bank, was not a description of anyone he actually saw. She said her husband was afraid of what the woman from Cincinnati might say about him and was trying to prevent her from being in a position to say it." He looked at Dessa. "Miss Morrow, I am withdrawing the detainment order. You are free to go." He paused. "And I owe you an apology. We all do." Dessa was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. 4 words, carrying the weight of everything she was not going to say in this room, in front of this man, about what the past weeks had cost her. She stood. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She walked to the door, and Corbin held it open, and she went through it into the October afternoon, and the light outside was the hard, clear light of a Montana October, cold and bright, and without any quality of mercy or its opposite. Simply the light of a day, continuing to be what it was, regardless of what had happened in the rooms beneath it. They walked to the sorrel in silence. When they reached the horse, she stopped and stood with one hand on the animal's neck, not looking at Corbin, looking at the street, at the boardwalk, and the storefronts, and the steeple of the church above the roofline, and the ordinary working life of a town that had decided things about her and been wrong, and would have to reckon with that in its own way and its own time. "It's not over," she said. "People don't change what they've decided simply because the facts change." "No," he said, "not right away." "But some of them will," she said. It was the considered conclusion of a woman who understood human nature without either romanticizing it or condemning it. "Some of them will," he agreed. She nodded once. Then she looked at him directly, with the full attention of those brown eyes that he had stopped trying to look away from some time ago. And he looked back. And there was a moment between them in which a great deal was said without the assistance of language. He helped her up onto the horse. He swung up behind her. They rode home. Diamonds. That night he went to Eleanor's grave alone. He went in the full dark, late, after Dessa had gone to her room and the cabin was quiet. He carried no lantern. He did not need one. He knew the ground. He stood in front of the graves in the dark and looked at where Eleanor's name was, invisible in the darkness, but known. He said her name. He said it the way a man says the name of someone he loved and lost when he is finally ready to speak it out loud again, which is to say carefully and with the full weight of everything it contained, and without the particular flinching quality that grief gives to a name in the years immediately after. He told her about Dessa, about the first morning and the cornbread, about the ledger and the horses and the garden and the marigolds covered against the frost, about the way she held herself when people tried to diminish her, about the Bible and what Dessa had written under Eleanor's words. He said, without planning to say it and without trying to stop himself once it had begun, that he thought he was in love with her. He said it to his dead wife in the dark of an October night on a Montana hillside, which was perhaps not the conventional venue for such a declaration, but he had not been asking for convention. He had been asking for honesty, and honesty required the admission. He stood there for a long time. Then he sat down on the cold ground with his back against Eleanor's cross, the way he sometimes had in the early years, and looked out at the dark valley and let the feeling be what it was, without trying to manage it or contain it or decide yet what to do with it. The stars were very clear. The air smelled of frost and dry grass and the particular sharp mineral cold of a Montana October night. Somewhere below the ridge, a creek ran over stones in the dark. The first sign of her was the sound of boots on frost-hardened ground, the particular careful step of someone moving in the dark without a lantern. And then she was simply there, beside him on the cold ground, close enough that their arms touched, pulling her coat around herself and looking out at the same dark valley without a word of explanation. He did not ask how she had known to come. She did not explain. She put her hand on his arm. Her hand was cold. He covered it with his own. They sat that way for a long time, two people who had each survived the particular kind of loneliness that comes from loss too large to share, sitting together in the cold October dark, not speaking, not needing to speak. The valley open before them and the stars turning overhead, and the ground beneath them holding the weight of grief and the weight of the living both, the way good ground always does, without preference or distinction, steadily and without complaint. The frost came again that night, heavier than the first time, and in the morning the world was white and quiet and transformed in the way that October transforms Montana without apology or warning, reminding everything living that the season of ease was finished and what came next would require a different kind of endurance. Dessa was up before dawn again. Corbin heard her moving through the cabin, heard the stove door, heard the soft percussion of her boots on the porch boards, and he lay in the dark of his room and listened to the sounds of her tending the garden in the early cold and thought about the night before, about the hillside and the dark and her hand under his, and he let himself think about it without pulling back from it the way he had been pulling back from things for 4 years. It was time to stop pulling back. He got up and made the coffee. When she came in from the garden with cold reddened hands and frost in her hair, she found him at the stove, which was not where she usually found him in the mornings, and she stopped for a moment in the doorway with an expression that was very nearly a smile. "The marigolds held," she said. "Good," he said. He handed her a cup. She took it and wrapped both hands around it the way she had that first morning, the morning he had brought her in from the rain, when her hands had been shaking with cold and exhaustion and the particular shock of a life dismantled all at once. Her hands were not shaking now. They were sure and steady and cold from the garden, and she held the cup and looked at him over the rim of it with those brown eyes that did not look away. They drank their coffee in the morning quiet of a cabin that had stopped being only his somewhere in the past month, without either of them marking the exact moment of the change. Diamonds. The days that followed were not simple. He had not expected them to be. The town processed what had happened the way small towns process difficult truths, which is to say, slowly, unevenly, with a great deal of private recalibration that expressed itself in public as a gradual and largely unacknowledged shift in behavior. People who had whispered stopped whispering, at least within earshot. People who had looked away began, tentatively, to look back. Miriam Cross came first. She arrived one afternoon with a covered dish and Oliver at her side, the boy carrying a clutch of late wild asters, with the solemn concentration of someone performing an important duty. She sat at the kitchen table and drank tea with Dessa for an hour and talked with the directness of a woman who had decided to do a thing properly rather than halfway. She did not offer a formal apology. She offered something more useful, which was her presence and her plainness, and the implicit acknowledgement that she was a neighbor and intended to behave like one going forward. When she left, Dessa stood in the doorway watching her go, and Corbin, who was at the fence line and could see the cabin from there, watched Dessa's posture change as Miriam's wagon moved down the road. The wariness that had lived in her shoulders since the first day she walked into Willow Creek eased by a visible degree. Not gone, but less. Diamonds. It was on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the detainment order was withdrawn, that Dessa walked into the general store alone. Not for supplies. Not because she needed anything from behind that counter. She went in because not going in was its own kind of surrender, and she had not come 40 miles through Montana rain to surrender to a town that had not even had the courtesy to ask her name before deciding what she was. Eugenia Follett was there. The Harlan sisters were there. 3 other women she recognized from Sunday service. They all turned when the bell rang, the way they always turned. Dessa stood in the center of the room and looked at them. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger or injury or the particular wounded dignity that might have invited sympathy. She simply said, clearly and without decoration, "I know what was said about me. I know some of you believed it. I am not asking you to apologize." She paused. "I am asking you to look at me. Not at what you decided I was, at what I actually am." The room was very quiet. "I am a woman who came here in good faith and was deceived. I am a woman who worked for her place here and earned it. I am a woman who stayed when leaving would have been easier because this valley is worth staying in." Another pause, the kind she had learned to let breathe. "That is all I have to say." She bought a length of cotton thread and left. On the boardwalk, she stood for a moment in the October air and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been braced for a long time finally releasing its grip. Not victory, not vindication, simply the particular relief of a person who has said the true thing out loud in the room where it needed to be said, regardless of what the room decided to do with it afterward. She walked back to the wagon. She had done what she came to do. Diamonds. Eugenia Follett came to the ranch 3 days later. She brought nothing and apologized for nothing, which was consistent with her character. But she stopped on the boardwalk the next time she saw Dessa in town and said, in the tone of someone making a formal announcement, that she had heard Miss Morrow had some skill with medicinal plants and that her own daughter had been having trouble with a persistent cough, and she wondered if Miss Morrow might have a thought about it. Dessa told her about dried thyme and honey and steam, about keeping the girl upright through the worst of it, about the elderflower infusion that Mrs. Hobart had used with particular success when the cough came from cold settling in the chest. Eugenia listened with the focused attention of a woman filing information for future use. She said thank you with the stiffness of someone unaccustomed to needing things from people she has underestimated. She walked away without looking back. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was the beginning of the recognition that Dessa Morrow was someone worth knowing. And in a town the size of Willow Creek, recognition was the foundation that everything else was built on. Dessa understood this. She accepted the limited thing for what it was and did not ask it to be more. A letter arrived from Jenkins 3 weeks after the detainment order was withdrawn. The handwriting was shaky, the lines uneven, the words sparse in the way of a man who is not accustomed to apology and is finding the grammar of it difficult. He said he had been wrong about what he saw. He said he was sorry. He said nothing else. Dessa read it twice. She folded it with care and placed it in the small bag that had traveled from Cincinnati to Montana and back to the corners of this cabin with her, the bag that had been her anchor and her armor and her last solid thing in the world on the morning Corbin found her in the mud. "I'm not ready to forgive him," she said. She said it without bitterness, as a simple, accurate statement of her current position. "But I'm not going to burn it either." Corbin said nothing. He thought it was the right call. Diamonds. The cabin continued its transformation. It had been happening gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way landscapes change when the right conditions persist over time. The windows were clean. The floor was swept and sometimes scrubbed. The table was clear. The almanac had margin notes in 2 different handwritings now, his sparse and occasional, hers consistent and detailed and planning further into the future than he had planned anything in 4 years. One morning he came in from the barn and noticed that the curtains were different. She had made them from fabric she had found in the cedar chest, not Eleanor's things, which she had never touched without being invited to touch, but a bolt of plain cotton that had been sitting unused at the bottom for years. They were simple curtains. They let in more light than the old ones had. The room looked different with them, looked less like a place where a man was keeping himself alive by force of habit, and more like a place where someone had decided to live. He stood in the doorway and looked at them. She was watching him from across the room with that expression of hers, the attentive, careful expression that was also, he had learned, the expression she wore when she was slightly uncertain about something and was trying to read whether she had overstepped. He looked at the curtains. He looked at her. "They're good," he said. Her expression settled. He noticed, around this time, that Eleanor's apron was still on its hook above the stove. Dessa's apron hung beside it, not overlapping, not crowding, simply present in its own right on the hook, next to the one that had been there for years. He had looked at this arrangement many times and had not yet found anything in himself that objected to it. He thought that Eleanor, who had been a woman of considerable practical wisdom, would not have objected to it either. He thought this clearly and without the particular ache that such thoughts had always carried before. The ache was not gone. He did not think it would ever be entirely gone, and he did not want it to be, because it was made of something real, and real things left real marks. But it had changed in quality, the way the character of a scar changes over time, from the sharp, constant awareness of damage to the subtler acknowledgement of what had been and what remained. Diamonds. On a Thursday evening in the second week of October, Oliver Cross once appeared at the edge of the property with his handful of wild asters and his gap-toothed smile and his announcement that his mother said Dessa was the best person in Willow Creek. Dessa crouched down to his level the way she always did. "Your mother is the best person in Willow Creek," she said. "I'm just the person who happened to know about elderflower." Oliver considered this with the serious expression of someone weighing competing claims. "You can both be," he said with the serene confidence of a child who has not yet learned that adults find generosity complicated. Corbin was leaning against the porch frame. He did not look away quickly enough, and Dessa caught him watching, the way she sometimes caught him, and this time he did not pretend he had been looking at something else. He held her look for a moment, and she held his, and something passed between them that was warm and unguarded and did not require management. Oliver presented his flowers and ran home, and the afternoon moved forward, and the valley held the last of the October light in that long horizontal way before dark. Diamonds. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch. This had become the end of their days, the natural conclusion of the ordinary evening. 2 chairs on the porch in whatever weather October was providing, which was usually cold and clear with the smell of coming winter in it. They did not always talk. Often they did not talk at all. The silence between them had become the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that 2 people build together over weeks of choosing not to fill it with noise. Dessa had the small bag in her lap. She had brought it out without explanation and was holding it with both hands in a way that was different from the way she had held it when he first saw her, the white-knuckled, desperate grip of a woman with nothing left. She held it now the way you hold something you have decided you are finished needing to hold. She opened it. She took out 3 things and set them on the porch rail in front of her. The wool blanket, folded small. The one he had left on the rail outside her door on the first night she had cried where she thought he couldn't see. A marigold, dried and pressed flat, gold gone to amber, from the first flowers she had planted in the garden along the front of the porch. And the Bible. Eleanor's Bible. She opened it to the back page and looked at Eleanor's words and then at the words she herself had added beneath them, and she looked at them for a long moment, and then she closed the Bible gently and held it in her lap. She set the folded blanket inside the bag. She set the dried marigold inside. She set the Bible inside. She closed the bag. Then she stood and carried it through the cabin door and set it in the corner of the front room, the corner beside the cedar chest. And she came back out to the porch and sat down. "I don't need to carry it any more," she said. Corbin looked at her. He thought about what it had taken for her to arrive at that sentence. He thought about Cincinnati, and the mill, and the advertisement, and the letters, and 40 miles of Montana road in worn-out shoes, and the depot bench, and the mud where he had found her, and everything that had come after. He thought about all of it as a single continuous thing, the whole long, difficult arc of it, and he thought about the fact that she was sitting on his porch in October saying she did not need to carry it anymore. He thought that was one of the bravest things he had ever heard a person say. He reached out his hand, the way he had reached it down to her from the horse on that first rain-soaked morning, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put her hand in his, and this time there was no storm, and no mud, and no desperate circumstances requiring a decision to be made quickly. There was only the October evening, and the valley going dark below them, and the stars beginning over the ridge, and 2 people who had each survived what they had survived and had found each other on the other side of it. Her hand was warm this time. He held it, and she let him hold it, and the silence between them was the good kind, the full kind, the kind that does not need anything added to it. After a long while, she said, "That first morning, why did you stop? On the road." He thought about it. "I don't know," he said. "I just did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "My mother used to say that Providence sends people when we need them most, not a moment sooner." He thought about Eleanor's cross and the smaller one beside it. He thought about 4 years of mornings that started there and ended at the work without anything in between that felt like living rather than persisting. He thought about a September morning and a shape in the mud beside a road and a woman who had looked up at him with eyes that had run out of tears and said, "I don't know anymore." He thought that Providence was an interesting word for it. He thought it was probably as good a word as any. He squeezed her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the weight of it was the easiest thing he had felt in 4 years, the most natural, the most right. The way a thing feels when it has finally arrived in the place it was always meant to be. The valley lay open before them, wide and dark and enormous. The way Montana always was. The way it did not apologize for being. The mountains to the north had gone invisible against the sky. The creek ran somewhere below, cold and constant. The marigolds slept under their cloth in the garden, protected and patient and waiting for morning. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight, warm and steady through the new curtains. The light of a place that had been put back together by 2 people who understood, from experience, what it cost to build something, and what it meant to choose to build it anyway. Corbin Hale sat on his porch in the October dark with Dessa Morrow's hand in his and looked out at the valley that had been his alone for 4 years and was not only his anymore, and he found that this was not a loss, but an expansion, not a diminishment, but an addition. The way good things are when they arrive, not to replace what came before, but to continue it in a new direction. He did not say any of this. He did not need to. She already knew.